My name is Luis Ramirez, and I'm presenting today my capstone philosophy thesis called Building Interior Bridges of Identity, a Theory of Authentic Integration for Catholics Experiencing Same-Sex Attractions. This is just a brief overview of the key terminologies relating to my paper. I'm mainly discussing the issue of authenticity and integration, as well as the dimensions of identity, objective and subjective, and introspective reflection. I developed my own original terminology in my paper because I had to narrow down the topic. It was a 27-page paper as it was already after the narrowing. But I realized that this issue of Catholic LGBTs and the Church is not only a very sensitive one in nature, but also very complicated in philosophical and theological discussions. Particularly the conflict between gender theory and Catholic teaching. It was a little bit too much to discuss the entirety of the LGBT plus umbrella, and so I had to narrow it down. Now, it's a practice in gender studies, in particular with identity names, to use either self-selected names, such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, etc., general descriptors like same-sex attracted, or non-specifying terms such as gender variant. So I developed my own term called PESSAs. It stands for person or peoples experiencing same-sex attractions. When I speak of an individual that has same-sex attractions, I will call them a Catholic PESSA, and plurally, Catholic PESSAs. This is a brief overview of the most important and relevant Catholic teachings from the Catechism relating to same-sex attractions. 2357, 2358, and 2359. 2358 is arguably the most important one in this issue, and I will get to that later, and it has to do with the language usage. So, a brief overview of my paper. I had 6 sections, 4 of which actually discuss the issue in great detail. First, speaking on the challenges, then the general structure to my theory of authentic integration, then supportive thoughts that could be helpful towards PESSAs with my theory, and lastly, testimony given by Catholic PESSAs that I discovered. The thesis of my paper is that PESSAs can be faithful Catholics that follow church teachings without having to renounce either their sexual or religious identity. To do so, they must authentically integrate their Catholic identity and their sexual identity. The major themes of this paper are listed at the bottom of the screen. These are not my subsections, they're just the key themes. In my first section, I presented the thesis, and then I gave a brief preview of how I came up with the name to my theory of building interior bridges. I was largely inspired by Father James Martin's book, Building a Bridge, and his concept of the two-way bridge. Father Martin talked about how bridges not only unite the great chasms of division, but also good bridges take people in both directions. And I realized that being very complex psychosexual individuals, we have multiple identities. And so there has to be in the process of integrating our identities, and sexual integration, human integration, we have to build interior bridges that connect these dimensions, which are composed largely from objective and subjective facts or qualities. So the term of interior bridges was derived from Father Martin's own book. In my section speaking on the challenges, I largely spoke of church teaching, the disinterest and antagonism toward Catholic PESSAs, and the necessity of integration. Starting forward, we're going to be moving much quicker, and I'm largely going to be speaking on the key arguments. If you feel the need to read what's on the slide, just feel free to pause my video and read it for yourself. So the biggest issue is regarding to the language usage in church teaching on chastity and lust. And this has caused a lot of problems for authentic integration. There's been a large resistance amongst Catholic PESSAs with the celibate lifestyle, and the integration process and lack of an authentic integration has usually resulted in larger struggle with chastity, as well as an increased experience of existential crises due to neurotic guilt and shame. Also, there's a wrongful assumption that's generally widespread and still very present to this day, that Catholic PESSAs are unfaithful to church doctrine if they embrace pride over their sexual orientation, such as openly telling people that they are homosexual or bisexual. And that is a wrongful view. There's a difference between accepting and acknowledging an aspect of yourself and living a lifestyle in accordance to that. Those are different realities. And this has led to a disinterest in pastoral outreach to PESSAs, as well as increased antagonism that has created a shaming culture that has really made the Catholic Church rather unwelcoming in the experience of many who have same-sex attractions. For this reason, the Church has a duty to establish and maintain a welcoming environment that helps authentic integration take place and maintain unity in the Catholic Church, as well as heal the wounds of division. Concerning church teaching, the usage of the language disordered was very problematic in this issue, particularly in intrinsically disordered and objectively disordered, as seen in 2357 and 2358. There are 5 total instances in the Catechism which the term disordered is used in, and from the subsection on the offenses against chastity. As you can see, I've underlined the top 2. If you see, all 5 of these issues are really sexual ones and concerning lust. So this is why I argue that really this is not homosexual attractions and acts are not disordered because they are homosexual. They are disordered because they are lustful, and actually they're equally lustful than heterosexual ones. So I really think that this has led to a scapegoating towards those with same-sex attractions in the church, and it has led to a lot of the unjust discrimination that they face. So really what we have to do is move on from this fixation on the language. There's a lot of push that's taking place on the possibility of updating the language, and multiple people have discussed this. The shaming culture is really the biggest challenge that's present with this disinterest and antagonism. With clergy members, I have an example here of Father Minkowski, which is a rather close-minded and limited view, a real lack of sensitivity and awareness that Catholic PESSAs not only face significantly difficult challenges themselves, but also need a lot of spiritual guidance in order to navigate these challenges. So the necessity for integration not only is an issue of unity, but really it's also one that is required to provide Catholic PESSAs with the spiritual resources and pastoral outreach. New Ways Ministry had a very awesome article that I've listed here, and in order for change and reform in the church to take place, we must begin with individuals themselves first. So the general structure, I really spoke on the objective and subjective dimensions of individual identity, integrating the Catholic identity and PESSA identity, and authenticity and interpretation of narratives. Individual identity has objective and subjective dimensions. An individual identity is made by integrating 2 or more existing identities. So the Catholic PESSA identity, as I will refer to it, is composed from Catholic identity and PESSA identity. So there's a total of 3 identities here. And I argue that an authentic identity as a Catholic PESSA is the most integrated identity form for Catholic PESSAs to hold, because it acknowledges both identities. The introspective reflection is very crucial for navigating narratives, as well as protecting the individuals from inauthentic integration, which really is always based on self-deception, repression, and blind acceptance of narratives. I have here very briefly listed the objective and subjective dimensions to each identity, and the premise of my theory is that the dimensions of individual identity include both of these, both subjective and objective ones. And all identities that we take to create a larger identity needs to integrate these dimensions, which is why I argue that the Catholic PESSA identity is the most integrated one, because it's taking the objective and subjective from the Catholic and the objective and subjective from the PESSA and bringing them together. So, as far as actually integrating the Catholic identity and PESSA identity, my idea of integration is that it can generally be understood as this union into a single whole. And authentic integration is always seeking to acknowledge truth of the objective. And I came with this example of the ex-Catholic lesbian. This woman, hypothetical of course, went through a period in her life in which she was repressing her sexuality and following church teaching. And during this time, she was being authentic to her Catholic identity, but she was being inauthentic to her sexual identity. Later on, she came to realize that she couldn't continue doing that, but then she flipped the situation the other way. And she simply chose to reject her Catholic identity, and that's why she's an ex-Catholic, and accept and embrace fully her same-sex identity. The issue with this situation is that this woman actually is authentically integrated in the sense that, she simply denied her Catholic identity. She's no longer a Catholic. So she's an authentic person insofar as she lives her life in accordance to her sexual identity. However, this is why the integrated identity of a Catholic PESSA is something that I argue it's the highest form of integration that takes place, because it honors both identities. It's a very difficult thing to do, but very much so possible. As far as authenticity and narratives, we really have to understand ourselves as relational beings. We discover ourselves and define our identity by interacting with other people, and as Alistair McIntyre spoke, we experience life as part of interlocking narratives. There are intrapersonal narratives, which relate to ourselves and our responses to the things in life, and interpersonal narratives, such as social norms, family upbringing, etc. Authenticity can really be understood as the truth that brings joy, fulfillment, and freedom in our life. And the authentic self is always going to resist when we try not to be that. So there's an importance in recognizing the limitations that we have as individuals when we're seeking to make an authentic integration of identities. Section 4, I really spoke on sexual attractions as an intrinsic quality in human nature, and personal autonomy, allowing us to have self-restraint over sexual desires. The freedom of the will really can protect us from allowing us to be subjected to narratives that define who we are. And Catholic PESSAs need to recognize that being very psychosexually complex individuals, we have multiple identities, and we have to integrate those and not let just singular ones define us entirely. There's a recognition that we can fulfill the needs of intimacy through other means other than sex, particularly family, friends, and community. I really took Michel Foucault. He's considered the grandfather of queer theory and was a homosexual man, a great philosopher. And he had this dislike towards the existential fixation of the truth of sexuality. He saw it as a waste of time. And really it was because sexuality for Foucault was something that was understood based on the experience of sexual desires. And with those being capable of change, really his whole thing was that individuals cannot come to know everything about themselves instantly. So this is why there's a need for healthy approaches to identity and sexuality in PESSAs. Carter Hayward spoke in Sexuality and the Sacred of how he thinks it's better for us to label ourselves as, rather than LGBT people, or such as a gay man or a lesbian woman, that it's better to just understand ourselves as people who act homosexually or heterosexually. And this relates a lot to the Kinsey scale, which was developed to present and allow an unlimited number of types of orientations and identities by creating a spectrum range between heterosexual and homosexual. Anything between there is really kind of a proportionality issue, and this is seen a lot with gender studies, with labels and names, and that's why people select themselves. Now, my last section was on authentic integration. I largely took the testimony of two Catholic lesbian women, one who is married, has a husband, while she still identifies as a lesbian, and has 6 kids. Her name is Melinda Selmas. She's the author of 2 books on sexual authenticity, and she is married to a man, and despite not being attracted to men, she fell in love with a man, and she considers herself to be in a mixed orientation marriage and created her own terminology called mom. Eve Tushnet is the author of Gay and Catholic, Accepting My Sexuality, Finding Community, and Living My Faith. She's a very well-known author and writer, and also lives a celibate lifestyle, and she's a convert to the Catholic faith. The testimony from Melinda Selmas is that she talked about her journey, and she spoke how when she was pretending to be straight and trying to conform to her life, to a narrative, an orientation of being able to change her orientation, she was depriving both herself and her husband from the truth of her authentic self. It also caused all sorts of wounds and problems in her life. And it wasn't until she integrated that she found a greater sense of peace and joy. Selmas argues that it's not impossible for a homosexual to have a happy marriage with the opposite sex spouse. My own experience speaks to that. I am a same-sex attracted, but have chosen heterosexual marriage for a combination of religious and personal needs. Selmas has spoken how this mixed orientation marriage is something that really opens a variety of possibilities for those who experience same-sex attractions that honors their religious identity and also their sexual identity. Selma's success in her marriage, she's largely attributed to the authenticity and honesty in the way that she communicates with her husband with the realities of experiencing same-sex attractions. She does not consider herself to be an ex-gay or to have been cured from same-sex attractions, and she sees that the denial of her queerness would really be holding back a very significant part of herself to her family and others. She actually considered there to be objective identity and subjective identity instead of dimensions. I found it interesting to read, but I really saw it rather than separate identities as dimensions. The identities themselves are the Catholic identity, the PESSA identity. So Tushnet gave a different approach. She has this amazing quote, and she really understands the role of narratives. And this was from an article that she wrote speaking between scripture and experience in life and negotiating these two. And she was careful in warning that we should be careful not to replace, our Catholic identity and understanding of scripture with our experience of same-sex attractions, because then we really put ourselves in entering a counter-narrative which inevitably leads to inauthentic integration. Tushnet has been very clear to speak about this, and she has actually presented an optimistic perspective on the ability to find intimacy through friendships and community as a lesbian woman. The conclusion to my paper was that authentic integration as Catholic PESSA is the most integrated form of individual identity because it integrates and acknowledges the objective qualities of the Catholic identity and the PESSA identity. The failure to accept or address objective dimensions of both Catholic identity and PESSA identity leads to inauthentic integration of individual identity. There are objective and subjective dimensions to an individual's identities, and authentic integration acknowledges the objective dimensions while distinguishing the subjective ones. Because our individual identity is composed of the multiple identities that we have as people, authentic integration of an individual identity has to acknowledge all of the dimensions to the identities that are being used to compose the identity held. And that's what I meant with the Catholic PESSA identity. It's compiled from the objective and subjective dimensions of Catholic identity and the objective and subjective dimensions of PESSA identity. Lastly, the experience of sexual attractions is natural to the human being, and therefore the repression of sexuality is always harmful. Our personal autonomy allows us to live with self-restraint so that it is possible to find and fulfill our needs of intimacy in non-sexual ways. We are complicated psychosexual beings and must treat ourselves with dignity, respect, and compassion. The Church has a duty to help Catholic PESSAs find a place, a home in the Church, and to inform the larger body of the Church of these issues, these distinctions, and the complications that come from it. And the work of priests such as Father James Martin has proven to be very fruitful and much so needed in the Catholic Church. This is just the abstract of my senior legacy. It's what it's listed on the SLU website and my works cited. And I would like to thank the people that were involved in supporting me in my project, making it possible for me to get to this point. And I really wouldn't have been able to develop this paper, 27 pages, but the 27 most difficult pages that I've ever had to write, and largely due to the complexity of the issue. So thank you for your time, and let's keep praying for Catholic PESSAs, for the wounds that they need to be healed, for the church to continue to expand and really seek larger opportunities to welcome them in the church, and to find a place for all, so that there may be bridges of unity that are built between the LGBT plus community and the Catholic Church, as Father James Martin said. But before we can do that, we really have to build these interior bridges ourselves.